George Russell on pole for the Las Vegas Grand Prix tomorrow. Lewis Hamilton starts 10th. It's finished, washed, past his prime, right? Let's have a look at some of the data. So, qualifying for the Las Vegas Grand Prix 2024 is in the books. And on paper, it does look like Lewis has been absolutely smashed. Like it was his mistake ultimately in Q3. But a little bit of scene setting before we get into looking at some telemetry traces. The first thing to remember is Lewis has been complaining about the rear of his car in competitive sessions for essentially the entirety of this season. And it all kind of culminated in the last race in Brazil, where in qualifying and in the race, often Lewis was getting big snaps of oversteer on consecutive laps where George was able to just smoothly, serenely even take the corners. On the face of it, Las Vegas shouldn't be similar, but if you remember in comms, Martin Rundle compared driving the current track at Las Vegas to driving around in the wet on your slicks. So it's not an easy challenge. It's really slippery, really easy to lock up, really easy to lose the rear. But the Mercedes car seems to have an advantage. And that advantage is in cold conditions, it seems to light up its tires quicker than everybody else. That's a trait that it's had right from the beginning. If you remember free practice 1 and 2, for example, in Melbourne, really cold, Lewis tops the timesheets and then come qualifying, it's just not there anymore. He doesn't even make it into Q3. So that trait should bring a big advantage in Las Vegas where the ambient temperature is 4 degrees. So the track temperature is like ice. And actually, that's how it's played out, hasn't it? There's been a Mercedes at the top of the timesheets for every single session so far this weekend. That's to the point that in qualifying, the Mercedes cars haven't had to run the same run plans as other teams. So, because they can light their tires up a bit quicker, it means that they have a fresher tire when they go for their balls out lap. They have slightly less fuel, so they have a slightly lighter car when they go and do it. Whereas everybody else is having to run a prep lap or two, so they run a bit heavier and they have a slightly used tire by the time they absolutely go for it. But there is a difference in the way that both Lewis and George create temperature in their tires before they go for a competitive lap. And I think there's a little bit of what they do in that lap to prepare their tires that might cause the problem that Lewis is having with the rears. Let's just have a little look. So what we have here is a prep lap from both Lewis and George in Quali 2 at Las Vegas, and I'm only looking at Sector 2, which is the technical part of the lap. In white, we've got Lewis, and in turquoise, we've got George. And you can see overall, looking at the lap, Lewis is about 1.7 seconds quicker than George. That doesn't make a big difference here in terms of competitive standing, but it does have an impact on how their tires perform later. So let's just have a little look. You don't need to focus on the delta this time because although there's a big difference between the two cars, this isn't a competitive lap, so they weren't setting a time. This is them just prepping their tires for the actual lap. But I do want to have a look at the speed trace, and I do want to have a look at the throttle and brake traces. So the first part of this that I want to look at is this section here, which is turn 12 towards the end of sector 2. And what that is a full throttle right-hander on a balls out quali lap and in the race. And what you can see is on the speed trace, George has this lovely smooth curve through that corner, whereas Lewis has a peak, a big trough, and then he comes back up again. And that's repeated again on the throttle and brake traces, where you can see that where George supplies the throttle smoothly with a little spike just at the end, Lewis has a big application of throttle, comes off it completely, brakes, and then lights up the rears again. So both of those are two slightly different ways of trying to get temperature in the rear tires. but one seems to put a lot more energy into those tires than the other. The other thing to look at here is what Lewis usually does, which is to brake harder and longer into each of the corners. Just look at his brake traces here, 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 and here. Every single time he's putting a lot more energy into the fronts and subsequently needing to add a few more revs, a bit more throttle to get his pace back up again. So my contention here is that at the end of their prep laps, George has gradually brought his tyres up to temperature, whereas Lewis has given it stabs of temperature to expose the rear tyres to heat in a much more aggressive way. And I wonder if it's not just about physically getting the tires up to a prescribed temperature for the lap, which I'm sure both of them are doing, but it's the way that that is delivered. So both of their tires are up to temperature, and they're probably up to temperature quicker than everybody else's, which is why even in Q2, Lewis and George were 1-2. But when it comes to the flying lap, so this is the Q3 runs. This is George's pole lap, a 1:32.312. Again, George in turquoise and Lewis in white. And this is sector 1. And what you can see here is the speed trace through turn 3. So that's the right-hander after the first left-hander of turn 1 and 2. You can see here that there's a big dip in the speed trace, and this is where Lewis's delta suddenly moves miles and miles away from George's, and that is because he's had a massive snap of oversteer in the middle of turn 3. He's had to come well out of the throttle. He's had to apply the brakes and then get back on the throttle again, and this unfortunately put him outside the white lines, gave him a track limit. So even if he had completed that lap, which he did, with a 1:35.181, the lap was discounted anyway, and he ended up 10th. Now, the difference in Q3 was that rather than doing just the one prep lap immediately out of the pits, Lewis, as opposed to what he had been doing before, as opposed to what George had been doing before, did an extra prep lap. And he's talked about this in the press conference afterwards, saying that that was a mistake. And I wonder if actually the mistake was that he tried in his previous prep laps prior to this lap to try and be a little bit less aggressive and didn't feel he'd got the temperature into the tires enough, so went for a second one and then had too much temperature in the tires and again caused a little slip at the rear. In comms, you saw his comment saying, "I have lost the rears, here it is." So there you go. Yes, all of this could mean that Lewis just doesn't have it anymore. But my feeling is more that his natural style, the way that he has been prepping his tyres since the Pirelli tyres came into use in 2011, the way that he's done it, which has paid dividends up until now, just isn't working with this type of car. And maybe it's just too late for him to change that approach. But I feel that that is one of the main reasons that he's having a recurring problem with instability at the rear of the car, which George is not having in their competitive balls out laps. There you go. What do you think? Let me know. Please like, please subscribe, please leave me a comment. We'll read every single one and we'll reply to as many as we possibly can. And we will see you guys in the next one.